very much. Hey, thank you. Thank you. Well, good morning. We are still just morning. Jack, Akim, you've lined me up perfectly this morning. So I'm going to just take the next 3 hours and walk you through a bit of a journey that I and my colleagues within CETSAT have been on over the last, the reality is 15 years, but actually the last 5 or 6 years, sort of going through with some of our clients. So CETSAT is an IT company, and we, about 15 years ago, picked up a corporate enterprise network, building management operational technology network in Canary Wharf. And that has evolved into a company called Juberi, which I will give a bit more intel on in a moment. So a brief introduction to smart buildings and our journey into them, the importance of cybersecurity in those smart buildings, an overview of a standard which we have adopted and indeed evolved, and then the implementation and benefits of that. And I think we'll save the Q&A later. So what is a smart building? Well, I heard a really great definition the other day that IT is the movement of data, OT is the movement of physics, which I thought was really, really good. Obviously, a smart building is a complete network of interconnected systems providing life support systems, air, water, electricity, everything to maintain those enterprise environments. And certainly in those environments, certainly around Canary Wharf and the city, there are typically 10,000+ people operating in those buildings at any one time during the working day. So our journey into that, as I say, started sort of 15+ years ago, and we were merely looking after the Windows environment, the application software in a particular environment, and the network that operated on it, or that those systems operated on. Now, we inherited the network. It was a flat structure, as Jack was suggesting, Class B network, 65,000+ addresses or addressable addresses, and ultimately only had about 350 devices on that network. Today, that network currently has, after a big transformation project over the last years, about 7,500, after a £300 million investment by the bank. And now they're starting the top 10 floors, where that will explode up to beyond 20,000 devices. So you can appreciate the complexity of that environment has just gone exponential. So we currently look after 43 buildings around the city in Canary Wharf, plus a bit of a nuclear power station with its BMS system. So I think the key thing is around the importance of cybersecurity is that back in, gosh, what year was it? 2018, WannaCry, you'll all have heard of that. So we had real issues with the vendors, the systems vendors, the Siemens, the Schneiders, the Honeywells, all the vendors who operated in those spaces. And we found ourselves in a position where every time we did a Windows update, it would kill the application software, the monitoring software that operated those buildings. And essentially, we were put on a patch freeze for almost 18 months whilst, the vendors caught up. And thankfully, WannaCry hit, when was it? Early May 2018. And the client suddenly, and dare I say it, the environment woke up to the fact that you've got to maintain your systems. And suddenly it wasn't you're breaking our network by doing Windows patching and patching switches and firewalls. Actually, the due diligence very quickly switched towards the vendors. Are you maintaining yourself? So secure by design, as has been discussed, is absolutely key. And I hasten to add the vendors now get this. However, as has been suggested earlier today, the vendors are somewhat slower, the operational technology vendors are somewhat slower at updating. So we have ways to mitigate that, which I'll mention. So obviously these devices, these PLCs, they run operating systems, they need to be patched. And certainly with regards to that life cycle of development, what we're seeing now is virtual patching. So whilst a CVE may have been identified, essentially at the network layer, we can now virtually patch devices whilst the vendors themselves may not have actually corrected the issues in the software working upon it. So we became aware of IEC 62443, ISA, a few years ago. Now, its notoriety came, you'll remember back in, gosh, was it 21, the Colonial Pipeline attack. So the Colonial Pipeline attack affected the eastboard US states. It knocked out the fuel, essentially, to run the east of the USA for quite a considerable period of time. And at that point, IEC 62443, although it has historically been used very much around CNI industrial environments, it gained its notoriety where the US government decreed that every piece of CNI in the US would adhere to this standard, which essentially focuses on those converged environments. So in IT, we have ISO 27001, amongst others, and in OT, IEC 62443 has certainly been a focus for a number of years. What we did during that project of that building evolution was we identified that A, there was a weakness in the client's risk appetite. Typically, corporate IT would try and get involved in operational technology. They'd want to grab hold of it, kick us out, and then they realise, oh, it's a bit different. We'll run away. And then a new CISO would come in, do the same thing again. But what we also realised is that within those converged /OT environments, all the different vendors would work in isolation. So we set up a thing called the Juberi Group a few years ago, essentially to bring those diverse skill sets of technology, cyber, and smart building architecture together so that we were doing the job once. So we were doing that built by design from a cybersecurity perspective, because even now there are big initiatives where Citibank, for example, they have literally stripped the building back to concrete, they're building up, and security has come in quite late into the discussion. So what we have done essentially is a bit of research and development. We've run a proof of concept last year within a bank where we have essentially adapted IEC 62443 into the smart building environment, taking very much the client through the journey, involving them, creating that team that Jack was talking about, where you've got to have each of your key stakeholders understanding their risk and owning the risk. And obviously, yes, greenfield, secure by design, a lot of the work that we're doing and we're seeing is refurbishment. So it's retrofitting cybersecurity into those environments where it has never been contemplated, really, because of that disconnect between the corporate and the building management and the operators, companies like CBRE and so on. So coming back into the framework, it was essentially created back in the early 2000s, evolved in the early 2011 into that more focused industrial environment, and essentially helps people understand that converged environment where typically the risk has been shared or indeed separated. And picking up on the Purdue models, which Jack was talking about, we've adapted that. Now, certainly, we are pretty much still it's sort of minimum viable product. We've done a lot of the work in Excel, and now we're starting to put it into a system that the clients can access, use for storing, obviously store their policies and documentation and so on. But certainly using that standard as the baseline. We're currently now working with 2 banks and it's evolving. And certainly where they're looking within that particular environment where they've invested a huge amount, what we found was we helped them with some policy management, and they have 65 headquarters globally where Windows 2000 was being used in the US. Such diversity in their network environments, their standards, everyone doing everything differently. So what we're doing is helping them now create that global policy where they have that accountability ultimately that they can hang their hat on. And therefore, you know, at the end of the day, the benefits speak for themselves. We've discussed this already today. Compliance with industry standards, certainly that whole thing about air gapping. When WannaCry hit, the banks pulled the connections out of their buildings so that they were completely isolated. But of course, that caused a great problem in their analytics. They couldn't actually get back into that data without taking it off on a USB or something. Now what we're seeing is, literally in the UK, the FCA is now requesting, not compelling, banks to share their consumption data. Green tax is coming. So it is gaining real focus by the banks. But ultimately, dare I say it, after about 25 years of what one might consider to be a smart building, I still don't believe they fully exist at the moment, but there is certainly aspiration. And into the future, what we're seeing is that whole smart building, smart city integration. So if XYZ Bank is kicking out 5,000 people at 5 o'clock in the evening, London Transport will be turning the power up on the tubes, but obviously if they're not churning those people out the doors, they don't need to. So getting that integration, which is a real conflict at the moment, where obviously the banks who own this data don't necessarily want to share it with the government because they might not trust the government on what they're going to do with it. So it's quite an evolving time and quite an exciting time at the moment. So that was a quick canter through. But I hope that was useful.
It was